I'm just absolutely delighted to have Bill come back. He's been a speaker here before, and I was looking, it's quite a while ago, but he has taught at Vaughan College in 2014 for a little while, as well as at Hofstra University, where he got his bachelor's degree. Bill has his master's degree from Columbia University. He has an extensive experience. He's worked in flight operations at Pan Am. He's been a writer, a journalist, a novelist. He's won awards. He was the only consumer advocate for the US Department of Transportation Future of Aviation Advisory Committee selected by the Department of Transportation Secretary Raymond LaHood. Loretta, do you have more to add? He's just an all-around great guy.
I would say he's the foremost aviation consumer expert in the country. And in our aviation law class, this is our passenger rights, which I put in quotes section, which Bill will definitely explain to us why rights belongs in quotes. And for the other students, it's just a fabulous opportunity to learn for someone who is fighting the good fight for all of us, hopefully more success in these coming years. So I will turn it over to you. Let me know when you want me to share the screen, and I will.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Loretta and Maxine, Dr. DeVivo, John, the Honorable John Golia, if he joins us. And it's always a pleasure, as I said. I taught at Vaughan, as you mentioned. I've lectured there many times. And even though it was 2 years ago, I want to thank Dr. DeVivo again for allowing me to do the launch of my novel, Half the Child, at Vaughan. And you might say, well, why, a novel and what's the connection to aviation? The novel is about a custody and abduction battle, but the protagonist, the narrator, is an air traffic controller about a couple hundred yards from where Vaughan sits at LaGuardia Airport. So it was the perfect venue, and always happy to come back. And like I said, hopefully next time in person. So who does the clicking, Loretta, you or me?
I have to do it because it's
Okay.
on my screen. So
Okay. Well, yeah, if you could click through. Tonight, we're going to answer definitively at least one critical question in aviation, and that is, where can you buy Bill McGee's 2 books? Okay, so that if we settle nothing else, we'll get that.
We shall see what.
So please click. Attention all passengers, we're going to talk about tonight. Half the Child I just mentioned, that's the air traffic control novel. But attention all passengers, it is, so happy to say it's still being used as a text at Vaughan. So it sounds like some of the students are familiar with it, so that's great. And I just wanted to give information on my website. It's halfthechild.com. No tricky punctuation or anything. And it's not just about shameless, it's also about contact information. So please, if anyone has any questions, comments, complaints, whatever, please reach out to me there. There's an email address through halfthechild.com. And so we can keep that up for a while, I guess. Just in terms of introduction, I'm hoping that we can have a very interactive discussion tonight, and I don't want to get up on the stump too long. I really would love to hear questions and have a discussion going. I've been asked to talk about passenger rights and about some of the COVID-19 protocols. And so we're going to talk quite a bit about the Department of Transportation and what it does and doesn't do, and what it can and can't do, and particularly what it certainly didn't do in 2020. So to start off with, I think we really need some context, and that is to speak about why the airline industry is unique and unlike virtually any other industry in the United States. And I don't know how many people are familiar with the concept of airline deregulation, the Airline Deregulation Act that was passed in what year?
1978.
1978. Okay, well, there's Charlie Leoka. He's another consumer advocate, so of course he knows. Good. Okay, Charlie, we expect you to do well on the multiple choice later. So in 1978, to be very, full disclosure, I spent most of 1978 nowhere near the airline industry, but about 7 blocks from Vaughan. I was at Monsignor McClancy High School, spending most of that year in detention. So I wasn't following the events in Washington too closely. There's a misconception, just to be very clear, about deregulation. I hear this all the time. People will say, well, the problem started when Ronald Reagan deregulated the airline industry. To be very clear, the deregulation of the airline industry was not done by Republicans or by conservatives. It was actually done by progressive or liberal Democrats. It was a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic White House, President Carter and Senator Ted Kennedy and many others. So the man that was charged by President Carter at the time with pushing through deregulation and shutting down the Civil Aviation Aeronautics Board that previously set flights and fares all across the country, that man was Dr. Alfred Kahn. And when he passed away, he passed away in 2010. Shortly before he passed away, a reporter interviewed him and said, well, you're the father of deregulation. And his response was, I demand a paternity test. So clearly that indicates that he wasn't happy with what was planned in 1978 and how things have worked out. But the reason I said this is such a unique industry and why it's different than virtually every other industry in the country is, as part of deregulation, this is critical, I think, to everything we'll talk about tonight. As part of the Deregulation Act, something called federal preemption was put in place. And that basically means that anything having to do with the airline industry, for all intents and purposes, has to be done on the federal level. So therefore, the rights that consumers have with virtually every other industry in the United States, you do not have with airlines. So that means that very often when there are problems with a given industry or a given company, a state attorney general will take action. In the case of the airlines, they cannot. So this past fall, for example, Frontier Airlines, which is based in Colorado, generated a tremendous number of complaints about failing to give refunds during COVID. And the Colorado Attorney General, if it was any other industry, would have taken action. Instead, all he could do was write a letter to the US Department of Transportation and say, please do something. I know we have a lot of JetBlue people at Vaughan on faculty and even some students that may work there. And of course, JetBlue is based right down the street, also in Queens. Back in the early 2000s, was it 2004 or 5, JetBlue suffered something called the Valentine's Day massacre, where they had a huge operational problem at JFK during a blizzard. And it affected operations for more than a week. I think it was almost 2 weeks. And so everything sort of fell apart. Dispatch and flight operations, crew scheduling, and aircraft and crews were out of place. Obviously the snow affected everybody, but JetBlue had a lot of problems that were specific to JetBlue. So because of that, and because of all the cancellations and the delays, the New York State legislature passed a passenger bill of rights for New York State. And I got a call from a reporter the day that it was passed. And the reporter said, what do you think? And I said, well, I have 2 thoughts. One is I think it's great. And 2 is it's a shame it's going to be, struck down probably within a week. I was off by about 5 days. I think it was 2 days later that a federal court struck it down. That's what we're talking about with federal preemption. The airlines are not like other industries from a consumer perspective. The states have authority that they have with other industries. So state, as I say, state attorneys general, state legislatures, even state courts. When you have a problem with a company, you can file suit. But in the case of the airlines, it's all on the federal level. So that's the pretext that we need, I think, to talk about passenger rights and talk about the airline industry. So I'm here tonight. All my opinions are my own, just to be very clear. I'm here as an author and a friend of one, but I've been a long time consultant to Consumer Reports. Most people know Consumer Reports magazine, but it's also the world's largest consumer advocacy organization, nonprofit. And so I'm their aviation advisor. And in that role, Consumer Reports often aligns with other advocates like Charlie, who's on here tonight. And we reach out to Congress and DOT and many other Washington agencies on behalf of consumers. And we have just come off, I think it's fair to say, the worst year for consumer advocates, certainly in my time, but maybe going back to the formation of the Department of Transportation due to COVID. So wanted to just give a brief overview and then, let you sort of dig in and talk about the issues that you are most interested in. But the bottom line is that, as we all know, we have a new administration in Washington now. But the previous DOT secretary who left in January, Secretary Chow, Elaine Chow, she was DOT secretary for 4 years. We went back and looked at the record, and we believe that she is the only DOT secretary in history to never have once had a discussion with consumer advocates. So in other words, she found time to meet with airlines very often, but never with advocates. And so because of that, we felt, I think it's fair to say, we're sort of banging our head on a brick wall. We have a new administration. We have a new DOT secretary. Everyone's hopes are high that consumers will gain some advantages now. We'll see. But the last year was extremely tough for consumers. I mean, we know that COVID was tough all around. Everybody had a bad year for the most part. But on two specific issues that I think we're going to touch on tonight, the DOT was completely unresponsive. And the first issue was dealing with flight cancellations and refunds for consumers. And the second issue was trying to put some health protocols in place, even something as basic as mandatory use of masks in airlines and airports in the United States. One of the few countries that didn't have such rules in place. We, meaning consumer advocates, reached out repeatedly to Secretary Chow throughout 2020, practically begging to say, could you please put some protections in place for consumers and for airline workers and crew members? And the answer came back time and time again, no, that this was up to the individual airlines. It was a market issue, and there was not going to be any new rules or regulations. And so that's why I opened up by talking about the Deregulation Act of 1978 and that term federal preemption. If the airlines were any other industry, there would be other places for consumers to go. You could go to your state attorney general. The state legislatures could pass laws that affect, air travel in those states. You could go to state courts. With airlines, I think if we learned anything else in 2020, it's that consumer rights are absolutely dependent basically on one person, and that's the DOT secretary. You could argue also the president that the DOT secretary serves, but when the DOT secretary, as Secretary Chow did in 2020, says, well, we're not going to do anything really, other than offer some non-binding advice, which they did, to be very fair. They put out some best practices, but there was no teeth to it. There was no enforcement element to it. So when when we went to the DOT, as so many others did, individual consumers did, the response was, well, we're not going to help. So what do you do then? Congress obviously is another channel, but there's takes a long time for stuff to get through Congress, and a lot of it is obviously political and depends on which party is in power, et cetera. And so for many of us, we were sort of, as I said, knocking our heads on a brick wall for almost a year now. And because the lockdown started just around this time, early March 13th or so last year. So now that we have a new secretary, on behalf of Consumer Reports, I put together a list of recommendations that we forwarded to Secretary Buttigieg. And
Tell me when to click.
please, yes, that would be great. Thank you. And by the way, that is the proper pronunciation. I spent 15 minutes learning how to say it properly. I found a video on YouTube in which a reporter asked Secretary Buttigieg, how do you pronounce your name? So if you're having any contact with him, I suggest you dig up that thing. He did it very slowly. So this is the document that I was just referring to. I know the type is very small and all of that, but what I'm going to do is I'll send a link so that anybody that wants it, can see this. It's a public document. We sent it to Secretary Buttigieg 2 weeks ago. We got confirmation that it was received. We haven't heard back yet, but we're hopeful that both Consumer Reports and other consumer organizations will hear from him and from his staff. And I'm just going to run through it quickly, but as you can see, it says their priority early actions. What we prioritized was recommendations having to do with COVID-19. So health protections, as I'm sure most of you know, on his first day in office, President Biden instituted a mandatory mask requirement for federal interstate transportation. So for airlines and other forms of interstate transportation. So that's good, but that's just one issue having to do with health protocols. So we have many other questions that we would like experts to look at in terms of all of the other health issues related to COVID and flying, social distancing, and aircraft cleaning procedures and airport cleaning procedures, and the HEPA filters on board aircraft. So we just want to make sure that everything that can be done is being done to keep passengers and crew members and airport and airline employees safe. And then the second issue there that we prioritize is the flight refunds issue that I referred to, and we can certainly talk more about that if you'd like. But basically, again, since the DOT is the only option for consumers, if the DOT doesn't act on something, you're out of options. And so if the refunds that have been withheld by the airline industry, and estimates are that it's anywhere between 10 and 15 billion dollars that the airlines have been sitting on all this time. If those refunds are not paid by the airlines and the DOT doesn't enforce it, well, then you're sort of out of options. The only protection you have is going through your credit card company with a regulation that called the Fair Credit Billing Act. But so we reached out to Congress, we reached out to Secretary Chow repeatedly, we reached out to the airlines directly. The bottom line is, I know I'm talking to an audience of people that are going to be going into the airline industry, and I think based on Vaughn's reputation and based on when I taught there, it was clear that many of you are not just going into aviation, but you're going to be the future leaders in aviation, whether it's on the government side or on the airline side or airport side. And so I think it's critical to have these discussions here at Vaughn about how the airline industry is different from other industries, and to sort of flip things. I started out as an airline employee, as Dr. Lubna mentioned. I worked 7 years in the airline, so I thought like an airline employee. And then I became a journalist, and I started writing about the airlines, and that was invaluable experience having worked there. But I started thinking about it from the consumer perspective, which was new to me. And then eventually I got with Consumer Reports and started advocating on behalf of consumers. But if you're going to be working in this industry, I think it's critical to understand things from the consumer perspective. When you talk about flight refunds, we are talking about the new DOT. You may be aware that the Department of Transportation every month what they call the Air Travel Consumer Reports, and it has statistics on consumer complaints, among many other things. Also flight delays and canceled flights, all kinds of things. It's for aviation geeks like me, it's must reading every month. I curl up with it for a better part of the night. But on the issue of flight refunds, you should know that the statistics that just came in from the DOT last week hot off the press, only about 5 days ago, indicate that the number of flight refund complaints filed with the DOT, not only were they higher than they've ever been, ever on record, they were 57 times higher than the 2019 totals. If that doesn't tell you that the system is broken as far as this goes, I don't know what would. I mean, those, if you talk to a statistician, anytime you have, complaints increase 57 times, something is really, really seismically wrong. And that's what happened with refunds. So if you step back a moment and look at it from a consumer perspective, the airlines will say, well, we need that money, or we'll shut down, or we'll have to lay people off. And we understand those concerns. As I say, I'm a former airline employee myself. I'm from an airline family, so I certainly have tremendous sympathy for airline labor. But when you think about it, there's really no other industry that acts in this way. In other words, if you go on Amazon and you go and order one of my books tonight, and Amazon swipes your credit card and takes your money, and then gets back to you and says, oh, we just realized we don't have that book in stock, but we're going to have it in about a year. So we're going to hold on to your money and earn interest on it, and then we'll give it to you next year. Well, that would be unacceptable, I think, for most people. And yet, effectively, that's what airlines have done with refunds over the past year. And so we and many other consumer advocacy organizations have been fighting the DOT to say, well, you need to release that money. The airline contracts of carriage provide rights for the airlines, but not for consumers. So those are the two key issues that that we've been working on for the last year, and certainly want to open it up to talk about that. But just to stay with the recommendations that we sent, I'll just briefly go through them. We also want the DOT to address something called unfair and deceptive airline practices. The previous administration, at the last minute, just before leaving office, sort of watered down the DOT's ability to address unfair practices. It sort of hampered the DOT itself, which is rather unusual for a federal agency to sort of restrict its own power to act. And so that has dire consequences, in our opinion. But there are also many other issues that we've put on this list. You have my contact information at halfthechild.com. I'm happy to forward this to anyone that'd like it, or anybody that wants, has questions about any of these issues. But among them, there's a consumer advocacy advisory committee at the DOT, and we felt that it became broken in the Trump administration. So we're asking that to be revamped. We also have been very vocal on the issue of family seating. We think it's unacceptable for a family to buy 4 tickets together on an airline and be told that a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old has to pay extra to sit with a parent or a grandparent or whoever it is that's taking care of them. Unacceptable. That's the type of fee that we just feel is, it's not just wrong, it's dangerous. And obviously children traveling alone, it's not acceptable. And airfare transparency is something that we've been very vocal about for many years. The need to absolutely make sure that that any consumer that goes online is given all of the total price with all fees, all not only the federal taxes and fees, but also the optional fees, quote unquote, for baggage and all the rest of it. The rest, I'm gonna. There's 2 other pages there, and they deal with a variety of protections for consumers and safety issues and health issues. And but I really want to get to your questions. So if Loretta, do we have the ability to sort of open it up and allow people to chime in if we go back to the?
So do you want me to stop sharing?
I think so for now. Yeah, it's the print is so small that it would be difficult anyway. But yeah,
definitely. Students can either ask the questions themselves, or they can put it in the chat, and we'll be happy to answer them. I mean, answer them, read them. I did want to let you know, Bill, that Alfred Kahn was the dean at Cornell when I was there, and
Ah,
he was a very nice man.
yeah, I've only heard good things. When I was researching Attention All Passengers, I took most of 2011 off from everything else just to work on that. He had just died. So, and I had, I'd hoped to interview him and he had just died. But I did interview 4 or 5 people who were very close to him working with it at the time. One of them is Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, people that worked in the industry, people that still work in Washington. I spoke to Ralph Nader, he was involved in this. And, there is, I think, a general consensus from those that were deregulating the industry in 1978, because they all said the same thing to me, that while there are tremendous benefits, I'm not trying to say that deregulation hasn't been successful in many ways. While there have been tremendous benefits, there were some side effects that they never anticipated. One was that they'd never anticipated that we would have fewer airlines in 2021 than we did in 1978 in the United States. They thought that the Department of Justice would be robust in ensuring that mergers were good for the public. And this is pure opinion on my part, but as somebody who has testified on the losing side numerous times in Washington, I always joke that my batting average is perfect. It's .000. I've testified in the House and the Senate against 5 airline mergers. All 5 were approved. So thanks for letting me weigh in. But so yes, from a consumer perspective, we believe that the consolidation is harmful. But the architects of deregulation in 1978, if you had said to them, well, in 40 years, there's going to be a handful of airlines, fewer than there are now, and that would have blown them away. Their intent was the exact opposite, was for new entrants, which we had for a while in the 1980s. There were a bunch of new airlines in the United States, but their intention was to open it up, to have more competition, that the government wouldn't be controlling who flies where and how much, to charge. It's hard to even comprehend, knowing that we live in a free market system, that as recently as 1978, someone in an office somewhere in Washington said, well, the fare from Cleveland to Denver is going to be $238. I mean, I asked somebody once, I said, how did you do it? He joked and said, well, we had a big dartboard and we threw a dart at it, and that was the price. So that was the idea, right? Was that it was going to open up. And so the opposite has happened, and then of course, there have also been some concerns on the safety side. And on the customer experience itself. If I just read one very brief segment, it's on page 64 of Attention All Passengers. Alfred Kahn, the father of deregulation, he testified before Congress, and he basically was asked, about deregulation, and he said, this is his quote, this deterioration in the quality of the air travel experience is a consequence in important measure of the failure of government to provide the optimal infrastructure. So there was a recognition from the person who was credited with bringing in deregulation that deregulation has failed in many ways, so.
Well, we have a question from Jeff. What is your take on personal health information on digital passports and privacy issues?
Okay, well, I have to be very clear and say I'm not speaking on behalf of Consumer Reports, which has not taken a position on this. My concern is a little bit more rudimentary, because we have had the Wild West in the airline industry in this country for the last year in terms of health protocols. We haven't even addressed the basics yet. We just got a mask mandate on Inauguration Day. We still don't have any mandatory rules in place in airlines and airports on social distancing, on best practices for aircraft cleaning and the rest of it. I think all of that has to come first. The issue of passports or validation, I think, is going to get extremely tricky if you're talking about international travel, for one thing. Is that what you're referring to, Jeff, on international travel?
Jeff?
Yes.
Well, at any rate, what we've learned over the years is that when one country unilaterally puts a rule in place that affects air travel, it can have consequences all around the world, and other countries sometimes retaliate by putting other rules in place or restricting service in those countries. But there's a lot to do on very basic stuff first. When you talk about social distancing, I mean, we've all learned about it in the last year, and we've all, I think most of us try and practice it in stores and public places and schools and every place else. But how do you do that in an aluminum tube, right? Well, so of the 10 scheduled airlines in the United States, does anyone know how many are currently blocking middle seats between strangers? Yeah, there you go. What airline is that? Delta, right?
Delta.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm up there with anybody when it comes to going on TV and radio and bashing airlines, and I bash right and left. But I'm a equal opportunity basher. I pride myself on that. I have no stakes in the airline industry. There's a preface in the beginning of Attention All Passengers. I have no stock in any airline companies. I don't have flight benefits any longer. I had the good fortune to work for airlines that all went bankrupt, so I have no sticky ties. Okay, I have no frequent flyer mileage. I don't even count mileage. But having said all that, I also believe in giving credit where it's due. And I think Delta deserves a lot of credit for this MTC policy, because the way things work in the free market is the policies that help consumers the most are often the ones that Wall Street hates the most. So Delta is currently getting beat up by Wall Street analysts who are saying that Delta is devaluing its stock price by not cramming strangers into middle seats, right? And I think most of us step back and say, well, that's a good thing that Delta's doing. Well, they're being punished for it. Southwest has been punished for years by Wall Street analysts for allowing you to have your first 2 bags checked free. The only airline in the country that is doing that currently, right? So for consumer advocates, it's a weird world. Whenever we see something, we say, hey, that's great, and we give credit. They're usually getting bashed in the financial reports from the analysts.
We have 2 hands raised, Victor and Amelia. Victor, do you want to go first?
Yeah, Bill. Since you just said about Delta, I wanted to add that I specifically, when I travel, I specifically only fly on Delta because right now Delta, from what I've seen and heard, is the only airline that separates seats, especially during the pandemic. So that alone, makes me a loyal customer in that sense. I don't mind sacrificing paying more for the sense of security. So I wanted to irradiate that. And then my question is, what's your thoughts as far as the vaccination goes and how it may affect the airline industry, whether or not it's going to be mandatory, and considering, specifically in America, how our mentality is on, hey, you can't get on this flight if you don't get the vaccine, and how people will take it as far as, hey, you're infringing on my rights. If I choose not to take it, then that's my choice. Why are you forcing me to take the vaccine, even though I don't feel comfortable to take the vaccine?
Right. Well, I think, we still have a long way to go as far as the vaccine. I mean, I tuned in yesterday morning to a House, the House of Representatives Aviation Subcommittee had a hearing, and it was about some of these issues with health protocols. And there were no consumer advocates there, unfortunately, but there were a lot of industry people. And one of the witnesses was from ALPA, the Airlines Pilots Association, right? So he's the pilots union. And he was asked about, he in fact asked the question of Congress. He said, why is it that airline pilots are not considered crucial? Why are we not further up the line in getting vaccines? Now, I know there are a lot of constituents out there and a lot of groups that all feel they should, move further up the line. But his point was, what hope does the airline industry have of continuing if, there's major sick calls from pilots, right? So we're not even at the point yet where we've ensured that, critical crew members have been vaccinated, let alone passengers, So these, not avoiding your question, Victor, it's so hard to try and prognosticate, where we're going to be in 6 months. I live in Connecticut, and I just got an email the other day, and they keep every month broadening how many people can get the vaccine. They lower the age, et cetera. And I guess this is probably one of the better states for that, because I was surprised to see that they said in this email the other day that their goal is that everyone in the state of Connecticut not will be vaccinated, but will be eligible by May 1st. So, from what I read, things are not that good in New York, to say the least, right? So I'm not on another planet. I certainly hear that. But so it's a tough question. I mean, how can an airline say you can't get on this plane if you're not vaccinated, if in fact the passenger doesn't have the ability to be vaccinated, isn't high enough online because of their age or their health or whatever, their job. It's always hard to prognosticate about the future of the airline industry, but I don't know that there's ever been a harder time, quite frankly. And I was at Consumer Reports during 9/11, and I remember saying to someone a couple of months after 9/11, wow, that was a once in a lifetime experience. And for the airline industry, we're probably never going to see anything as dramatic again. I firmly believe that this is much more dramatic for the airline industry. It may not be as dramatic in terms of the shock and the horror on 9/11, but in terms of the long-term effects. I mean, basically, after 9/11, starting the next day almost, the Department of Transportation under President Bush was very proactive. We researched this all recently and went out and put a whole bunch of new rules in place with cockpit barriers and security procedures and the formation of the TSA. And, you can argue all day about how good a job the TSA does or doesn't do. That's not the point. The point is action was taken. Here, it's like nobody knows, I mean, the goal after 9/11 was, well, how do we secure aviation so that people will get back on planes? And I think it's fair to say that, with some problems along the way, that goal was met more or less. But how do you do this? I mean, we get letters at Consumer Reports from people saying, that they have no plans to fly regardless of whether or not they have a vaccine. I don't know what the airlines are going to do to get those people back. I just saw the other day that the sales of motorhomes are doing well. I'm sure there's a connection there. I don't think that's unrelated. So this is just about the hardest time ever. I mean, people like me, come and talk, and we say, well, we think in the next year such and such is going to. This year, I wouldn't go more than a week out. It's really, really tough to try. I mean, if anybody feels differently, please speak up. I mean, is there anyone that feels like you have a good sense of where we're going to be a year from now? I think it's almost impossible at this point. I'm talking about the airline industry specifically, not the country.
Well, like you said, Bill, the airline industry is a very unpredictable industry. And not to get off topic about the airline industry, where, even when it comes to newer aircraft being certified for passenger flights, normally with the history of aviation, a great success of an aircraft can't happen unless there's some type of great misery that starts the aircraft off. So the same thing happens with the pandemic. Me personally, I was just curious as far as how, your viewpoint of the pandemic affecting the future. But like you said, it's hard to even to form that question, let alone answer it. So
yeah, it is. You're right, Victor. And I have to say that unfortunately, the airlines in the United States have really fallen down on this. If their goal is to get people to get back on airplanes, they've made a lot of mistakes. I mean, big mistakes. And so, first of all, they've angered untold numbers of people over refunds and not responding well after the pandemic. So the idea that, when let's just fast forward and let's just say, okay, this is an absolute best case scenario that everybody, that needed to be vaccinated has been vaccinated, and COVID-19 is more or less under control, and we're back, and schools are open, and restaurants are open, and all that stuff, and everybody's, we're where we should be. That doesn't necessarily mean that airline traffic is going to be back to where it was in February of 2020, right? So again, I mean, we hear from people that, that say this, that, well, I lost my job last year And I had made a reservation in good faith before last March. And my wife and I, or my husband and I, or whoever and I put $500 down. And this airline has been sitting on my $500 for more than a year. And we're out of work and we need the money for rent and groceries or whatever. And I'm never giving that airline more business. I don't care if it's 10 years from now. And we get these letters, trust me, we've quoted some. I mean, we've had, we've done a couple of webinars. So there's a lot of anger out there. And, my response to airline CEOs is they have, believe me, I think it's fair to say this. I've knocked heads with enough airline CEOs in Congress and other places over the last 20 years. They have wanted a secretary like they had in Secretary Chow forever. They wanted a secretary who would say, it's all up to the free market. It's all up to the airlines. We're not going to, make any rules mandatory. Well, my question quite simply is, well, how'd that work out for you? It's not working out too well for the airlines, because I think more important than asking people in polls, are you going to fly again, is when you see confidence polls, where you take polls and you say, well, what's your confidence, level about, doing certain activities? And they're very low right now. There isn't a lot of faith. So we'll see what the mask mandate did. We'll see what other steps the new secretary is going to take. We'll see if that restores confidence, but I don't think you can give good grades to airline CEOs in the US where they have really acted over the last year like, well, they'll be back, so we don't need to do much to have them, to bring them back and to make sure that they're happy when they come back. I think that's a fair assessment.
Emilio, did you have a question or?
Yes, I have a few. Yes, I don't know where to start, but yes, hello, Bill.
Hi.
Essentially, I have a project regarding this, the aviation industry and COVID-19. I know this is more a consumer and more passengers issue, so I will go directly to the consumers. So first, with the refunds, do you think that the government, well, if the airlines are taking back the refund, do you think the government needs to get in a, how can I formulate this? Do you think the government needs to pay those refunds so the airline doesn't be affected as much as it's supposed to be with the refunds?
Just to be clear, are you saying that the government would force the airlines to pay them or would pay them themselves out of tax?
No, if the government needs like give economic support to the airlines so they can give the refunds to the people.
Well,
so
I think
my second question is how smooth they can be. How's the communication with the airlines, the airport, and the other retailers?
Well, I think, in answer to your first question, I think, we've already seen 2 taxpayer-funded bailouts since COVID-19 started for the airline industry. And in fact, for the larger aviation industry, for airports and others too. So we've already seen 2. There's discussion right now about a 3rd one underway. At the congressional hearing that I tuned into yesterday morning, that was the main topic. And all of the representatives from the airline trade organizations and the airline unions were all saying they need that 3rd bailout. So I think in effect, we've already seen that to an extent. I mean, look, there's a lot of suffering going on because of COVID, economic suffering. I mean, not just the health issues, but not every industry got a bailout, right? I mean, where I am here, I worry about small businesses too, not just big corporations. I worry about like, will my barber be open? Will my gym be open? These are all small business people, will the local pizza place stay open, So I think from a communication perspective, the idea that the airlines received all this taxpayer money and at the same time were holding back on those refunds, I can't even measure how much anger that has caused in consumers. And by the way, this isn't just me as a consumer advocate saying this. We get letters that say this. People are not oblivious to this. I can't tell you how many of the letters said, I just read about the bailout. I paid the airline twice. I made a reservation before COVID, and then my tax dollars gave them a bailout, and I still can't get back my $250, and I need it. I need it for rent. I hope that addresses the first question. I'm not clear on the second question about communication.
So the second question was answered. It's just how if the third bell comes in, do you think that the airlines needs to start with the refunds?
Oh, no
Or
question. Yeah, we said it before the first one. So absolutely. Yeah.
so
And
the money, where's the money going? Like, yes, where's the money
where's it
going?
coming from, you mean? I mean,
No, like the airlines get the money and where is going? How they manipulate the money?
well, the airlines, publicly have drawn a direct line between, in a way, this is what I think is happening. I think what they're doing is sort of pitting consumers and labor against each other. And I think in many ways we're natural allies with the airline industry. I personally have worked with labor organizations a couple of years ago, and both Professor Alcalay and Professor Golia, who I see has joined us, they were both there. We had an event with the Transport Workers Union to discuss maintenance outsourcing. I didn't approach it as a labor issue, although it clearly is when work is sent outside the US. I approached it as a consumer issue, as a safety issue. So I think there's a natural alliance between consumers and labor. And I believe, want to call me paranoid, go ahead. But I believe that airline executives in the last year have tried to put a wedge between that by saying publicly, well, if we give the money in refunds, we're going to have to lay people off. They draw a direct line there. Well, I have a lot of questions about that. Let's start with executive pay. Why don't we start there? Let's have the discussion start there. And then we can, let's open up the books and let's talk about where the money is going. To say, well, this $250 means that a flight attendant is going to get laid off. Well, then I would argue you weren't running your business very well to begin with, because the fact is, other industries, when they don't deliver, this is a basic contract law in the United States. I mean, I've talked to lawyers and they've explained it to me. I'm not a lawyer, but they've explained it very well. When you pay for something, you're paying for product, goods, services. When it's not delivered, you get a refund. It's just that simple. And other industries, like I said, I mean, I gave the example of Amazon. Amazon can't tell you, well, we don't have it in stock. We're going to hold your money and maybe we'll get back to you next year. Or maybe 2 years, So that's where we are.
Ahmed, do you still have a question? You had your hand up before.
No, it's okay. You moved on. That's all right.
Okay. Maxine had a question. How do you feel about being able to buy the seat next to you the way, for example, Emirates does?
Yeah, in other words, paying for 2 seats to keep one empty is what you mean, right? Yeah.
Paying a much cheaper price.
Right, exactly. Again, I mean, first of all, we're sort of shooting from the hip, I think, in that we haven't really had, and again, I know I've said it 1,000 times, but shame on Secretary Chow for not doing this. We haven't really gotten enough of the science to determine, well, what is sufficient here? We're sort of, we're allowing the free market to come up with their own ideas, and there are ideas all over the world because obviously it's a global industry, and so we're seeing different things. You never want to criticize something that is an improvement, and that's certainly an improvement, but the question is it incumbent on the passenger to have to pay for that, right? I mean, because then I think it raises issues of privilege, quite frankly, in other words, when it's hard enough for some people to afford a seat that they're going to put themselves in, let alone an empty seat, and so, I was at a forum in Washington a couple of years ago, and I was, on my high horse, and I was criticizing, the airline executives were in the room, and I was criticizing that seats had gotten smaller in economy class. And I wasn't just criticizing as a comfort issue or a value issue, but as a safety issue in terms of emergency evacuations and a health issue for clotting issues, et cetera. And I said, this is, we had the definitive proof. I wrote a column for USA Today where I showed that, in fact, it's not your imagination. Seats have gotten tighter, both the width and the pitch, the legroom. And an airline executive this public forum and said, well, then if the seats are not comfortable, then upgrade, buy a seat in business class to first class, And I burst out laughing because I thought, that I had gone back to France in the 18th century and, I was being told, let them eat cake, that's not a sufficient response to a legitimate concern, especially one that has to do with health and safety, to say, well, buy your way out of it. So I don't mean to say that there isn't value in it, Maxine. I think it's a good question. That, you know, airlines are scrambling to find answers, and I get it. I'm not, you know, just because we're consumer advocates, we're not oblivious to the economics of this industry. But you know, that's why so much credit to Delta, because they are keeping that middle seat empty. We'll see if they continue to do that. We don't know, but they are. But it's hurting them financially in one way. But this is the part that never seems to, you know, to come up, and that is, well, someone here tonight just said, well, Delta's their favorite airline now, in part because of that. So what about that long-term value? You know, I think, to be honest, when I've talked to regulators and advocates and airline executives in other countries, I think, quite frankly, there's a longer-term vision. I think in the United States, the focus is always on this quarter. We have to make money this quarter. And so to say, well, you know, the Wall Street analysts who say Delta's leaving money on the table, they're leaving empty seats. But what if Delta comes out of this pandemic as the far and away passenger favorite? Isn't that worth something economically, you know? So those are the types of discussions I think we should be having.
Trevor, did you want to ask your question, or did you want me to? Why don't you go ahead?
So, Bill, do you think Delta's building a reputation for themselves, like right now?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's good. I think it's positive, you know? I mean, to be honest, if I was a consultant to Delta, I would tell them to make more consumers aware of it, you know? I would put some money into advertising this, you know? Those of us, look, I'm a self-professed aviation geek, and you know, every morning I start my day reading all kinds of news items about the aviation industry. I'm aware of this, but I always gauge by when I talk to people that are outside, not people at one college, not people who are working in the airlines. And I've said this to people recently that have nothing to do with the airline industry, friends and family and stuff. And I've said, well, you know, and every single one of them has said to me, really? I didn't know that, you know? So my answer, Trevor, would be, you know, they're doing a good thing, but I don't know that enough people are aware of it. So I would, you know, you'll see it when you go on their website. But right now, if I was Delta, I'd be making that the focus of our advertising. You know, perhaps they're afraid of doing that because maybe they're thinking that they're going to rescind the policy soon. I don't know. I don't have you know, an inside source here that's going to say whether or not they're going to, you know. But again, full credit to them. They deserve full credit. You know, different airlines do good things, and like I said, we always try and give credit. Southwest deserves so much credit for not having onerous change fees. They stand alone with that in the US, you know, and for not having the first 2 bags, you know, check fee. And, you know, I was just looking at some of the voucher policies, and I saw that one airline was better than the other, you know. So when airlines stand out and do the right thing, it always puzzles me why they don't do more to capitalize on it, you know. But Delta, in my view, I think is, you know, they're standing alone right now. They're the one airline in the United States that's saying, we're going to continue to do this, at least for now. Let's hope they continue to do it.
Hey, Bill, could I jump in there for a second?
Yeah, Jeff.
So, you know, I spend a lot of time at the airports and I talk to these people, and, you know, I need to sell advertising too, right? So I say to these people, just what you're talking about, your message is not getting out of the airport.
Right.
It's not getting to the public. They don't know what you're doing here. Terminal 4, Terminal 1, they put out newsletters every 2 weeks about what they're doing. And it's great stuff. And people still feel confident when they go to an airport.
Right.
But they're bleeding so much money that $200 is almost too much to ask for anything. So that's part of the problem we're facing.
Yeah, you know, Jeff, I couldn't agree with you more. I've seen it on so many issues where, again, I mean, you know, the nice thing about working for Consumer Reports, I don't mean the magazine, I mean the entire institution. There's no advertising whatsoever. There's no corporate connections. So we're free to say whatever we think is fair. And that's what we do. And we strive to be fair. And we try, you know, like I said, we try to give credit. And whenever I see good airline policies, I have the same experience you have, Jeff. It's like, well, why am I the one that's telling somebody this at a party or a wedding or something, and they didn't know about it? You know, I would be shouting it if I was Delta right now. And then I think it might also shut up the Wall Street analysts that are hurting Delta, by devaluing their stock, to say, well, what about the fact that people are happy with us? How many people are happy with the other airlines right now?
Right. No, it's true.
Yeah.
When you're bleeding, that's what happens.
Yeah. Well, again, I think it has to do with that sort of short-term mentality. It's quarter by quarter.
Mhm.
And this isn't, look, I don't have to say this at Vaughan College because this is what you guys are doing. It's all about infrastructure in the aviation industry, right? And it's all about long-term commitment. I mean, and building airports and improving safety and all the things that you need to do. You don't see a payoff right away, but if you don't do it, you're harmed right away, so.
But Bill, don't you see this as similar to the airlines always being loath to compete on safety? So competing on a health measure to me seems similar to competing on safety.
That is such a great observation because I actually talked to a friend about this last year in the industry, because I was watching an interview. This was in the summer when there were at one point in the fall, I know there were 4 US airlines that were blocking middle seats. JetBlue, American, and I think Southwest. If I'm wrong about the other 3, I'm not sure. That's right, Charlie. And then, now it's just, then there was one, now it's Delta, right? Well, last summer I was watching, I think it was CBS Good Morning. It was one of the national shows. And there was a senior person from United Airlines in Washington, DCA airport. I don't call it Ronald Reagan Airport because he fired all the air traffic controllers, so I don't think he should have an airport named after him, but that's me. Anyway, it's Washington. One president is enough for any airport, right? I mean, come on, we don't need 2 presidents' names in one airport. So anyway, he was at DCA and he was being interviewed, and he was disparaging another airline for having empty seats when United didn't. And Loretta, exactly what you just said. I said, this is the first time in my life I've ever witnessed an airline executive publicly making a comparison to another airline on a health issue. The weird thing was he was on the wrong side of the issue. This was representing the airline that was putting people in the middle seats. And he said, oh, this is just optics. This is just for show, what they're doing. Well, there's a gentleman at MIT who just did a study last year. I know Professor Golia knows him. We've talked about him, who just did a study last summer about the statistical study of the risk of COVID if someone, is a carrier and they're in the seat right next to you or, one over. In other words, in the middle seat or 1 seat away. And, it's not surprising to learn statistically your risk goes up if the person is right next to you, right? So, and there's a lot of talk about HEPA filters. I looked into that last year. I wrote an article for Condé Nast Traveler magazine about it. And they're everything that you've heard. You hear that they're so great. They're like 99.7% effective or something. And hospital grade, you hear that all the time, but there's an issue, right? I mean, the filter is in the top of the cabin and someone's sitting next to you, right? So if this person is sneezing next to you, not getting to the filter before it's getting to you, right? So we still come back to the basics. We have this terrific technology in the HEPA filters, but you still have social distancing. I don't know if I'm wrong about that at all. Maybe Professor Golia would know more, but I mean, isn't that what I've been told, that you still have the social distancing issue with the filters, right?
Yes, unless you take the cold air vent, the little ball that's up over the overhead, you aim that down at your head, and you're getting fresh air that has been filtered, but nobody has told the passengers that. So that it's a 2-part system.
Yeah, I mean, so why talk about not sharing stuff, huh? That's critical. Wow. Well,
Yeah, no question. I mean, I just did it. I just flew and I had it blowing right down on me.
Right. Well, you see, so this is what we're saying. When we were this is, I want to say on the one hand, this isn't about politics. On the other hand, it is about politics. To say that we had a Secretary of Transportation who said that, well, at any cost, we're not going to put any new regulations in place, period, even when it's health, life and death, health issues. So Secretary Chow made a decision, but we were saying, look, at a bare minimum, start doing the science here. Start, finding out, well, what are best practices in terms of that? As I said, they put out a document last July that had some best practices, but there wasn't the hard science of, well, how do you work out social distancing in a metal tube? How do you work out some of these issues? With cleaning, aircraft cleaning. I worked in my career in the airlines for 7 years. I worked in ground operations and flight operations. So I used to go around the world and have to, deal with outsourcing, cleaning, aircraft cleaning and things like that. And on charter flights, military flights. And, each airline has, it's all outsourced for the most part. I don't know any US airline that has its own in-house cleaners, but the oversight of that cleaning, there's no question, I think, that they have all upped their game. You can go on any US airlines website and they will say, we're doing this, this, and this, and, electrostatic and all these new technologies, and that's great. But a fair question is, well, that's happening on the overnights for the most part, right? On the RONs, as they call them, the remaining overnights. What happens throughout the day, right? So if you're on a short haul carrier where that aircraft is flown 7 times in a day, which is not unheard of. Now it's 9:30 at night. Is that electrostatic cleaning still holding up? I'm not pretending to have the answers, and again, I want to make clear, but we think these are the types of questions that need to be answered, and so we'll see if the new secretary goes down that road. But we don't even, we're sort of guessing in some cases as to what the best practices are.
Victor, you had another question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, just to interject on what you and John said, and it made me think that I don't think getting the message out there is mainly the big issue. It's whether or not people will pay attention to the information that's being put out there, because I've noticed it every time I fly, because I'm like a hardcore aviation enthusiast. When I book a flight, I don't just book a flight on a window seat. I look at the type of aircraft I'm flying on, what series it is, which manufacturer makes it. I specifically look for a specific aircraft that I want to fly on, and depending on the product on that aircraft, but that's just me. But even when they do their safety videos, I've noticed that Delta actually explains, they have state-of-the-art filters. They're doing everything they can to make sure that you have a safe flight. And they actually explain in the video, and even within, not their FAQs, but when you book, after you booked your seat, if you look at the details on the aircraft, there is little information that shows what exactly is being done to clean that aircraft, what products they're using to clean that aircraft. Basically everything and anything that does with keeping you safe during the pandemic. So like I was saying before, I don't think the information so much isn't out there. It's like, even now I've noticed that flight attendants, they don't do the safety demonstrations physically anymore. They put on a video and they stand there because they know, oh, I'm going to tell you what you need to hear, but people immediately go to their phones. Even today, when I was on my flight to Florida, flight attendant said, "Sir, please put your mask back on, or please turn off your phone because we're about to take off." He said, okay. But then he went right back on his phone and was just really blunt about it. And so it's like, there's so many aspects on how to effectively put the message out there. And yeah, the information's out there, but how do you tell people that this information out there without making them feel that they're being forced that this information is out there? I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, well, and you raise a great point. The fact is that there's a statistic that another consumer advocate that Charlie and I know raised about 2 years ago. American Airlines, in one of their annual financial reports, gave out a statistic that I, for one, had been looking for years. They broke down their passenger base, and you have to figure, if this is American Airlines, this is pretty emblematic of the US domestic market. American Airlines said that something like 87% of the passengers on American Airlines every year fly less than once a year. That statistic it drives just about everything we do at Consumer Reports on airlines, because when we finally got our hands on that number, this is in direct response to what you said, Victor. I remind myself every single day, as I said, if we're doing confessions, I'm as big an aviation geek as there is. And you could bring in a lot of witnesses from former relationships who come in and testify to that. People that I angered by talking in Z time, things like that. So the fact is that we have to remember, most people in the United States that get on an airplane once every 15 to 18 months, something like that. We're not talking post-COVID, we're talking pre-COVID, right? Now, who knows, all bets are off, right? So that drives a lot of what we're doing. My point is, yeah, sure, I've been writing and advocating about basic economy for years. Most Americans don't know what basic economy is, right? So this is a problem. From a consumer advocacy point, this is a problem. I know it's been around for 4 or 5 years. I was writing about it 4 years ago, 5 years ago. But people go on and they go on Expedia and they say, hey, look, honey, wow, this flight is $40 cheaper. And it says basic economy, but they don't know. And then they call up people like me afterwards and said, you'll never guess what happened. I'll say, oh no, I can guess. let me guess. They wouldn't let you bring on a carry-on. Yeah, no, I know, so there is a huge disconnect. I think you put your finger on something between what we in the community, the aviation community, whether it's at Vaughan College or advocates or the airline industry or FAA, whatever, what we know and what the average flyer knows, And think about it, like there aren't too many industries where, they may be buying a new car or a new house or something, where you only deal with the company every 15 to 18 months, right? Most times it's much more frequent. So this is a problem. It's not just an advocacy problem, it's also a safety problem, right? You were talking about, emergency evacuation procedures. Well, we could talk about that for another hour and a half, and talk about, we have seen real world examples now. This isn't theoretical anymore. This isn't anymore like people are pundits and talking about this. We have seen the documented photos and videos of burning commercial aircraft and people walking away from the burning aircraft with wheelies, right? With carry-ons and laptops and things like that. Now, this is, to me, top of the priority list in terms of education, because this is life and death. And how would you like to lose a loved one that may have survived that accident, but somebody was clogging up the aisle, getting their overhead bin open to get their carry-on bag out, so there's a place to start with education, and there's plenty of blame to go around, I think, with the Federal Aviation Administration, with the airlines. But, Loretta mentioned it before. Professor Rockley said, the airlines don't like to compete on safety, right? So it's sort of a taboo subject. I've done research into, the making of those videos that you mentioned, the flight attendant briefings. And it's very tough because if you're too strong, the airlines have a concern that you're going to scare people and you're not going to want to fly, but on the other hand, there's life and death information in there, I was traveling with my girlfriend about 2 years ago, and I pointed to the lights in the aisle, and I said, those will light up, and lead us out. She'd been flying her life. She had no idea, right? She had no idea. She's like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, the first thing I do when I sit down is I count the number of rows. I taught my son when he was this little. I wasn't trying to scare him, but when he was old enough to count, I mean, we're talking young, little. I said to him, how many rows is it, to the emergency exit? 4, so 1, 2, 3, 4. If it's dark and you can't see because the lights are out, I don't want to scare him and say smoke, you go 4 seats and then you make a right, there isn't enough of that. There just isn't. Yeah.
Thank you, by the way.
Thank you.
John, were you talking?
Yes, as soon as I figure out how to unmute it. Bill, there's another issue there. On some airlines, the floor path lighting is white coming up the aisle, and then where the exit is red. On another airliner, you come up the aisle, and where the exit is green. They're not consistent. So if you happen to be somebody that's flying on the red airline forever and ever, and then suddenly find yourself on the green airline, there's an emergency, you're going to be confused. Nobody ever tells you that.
Or if
Yeah.
you're colorblind.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I was reading about automotive safety recently, and up until it was fairly recently, it was only until like the 1960s with Ralph Nader, transmissions, automatic transmissions, we're not even talking about stick shifts, but automatic transmissions in the United States didn't always have the same format of gears: park, reverse, neutral, drive, low, So on some, park was in a place where reverse was on others. So it led to a lot of accidents. So you would think by now those things would be standardized, right? Like, just as traffic lights are standardized. So if you're colorblind and you see a traffic light, you still know which one is green and yellow and red, right? I mean, you still, you know from the positioning, right? Because it's standard.
Well, didn't it used to say red lights lead to white lights, lead to the exit? And they don't say that anymore.
No, I've noticed that. The last time I saw a demonstration where the lights were lit up during the briefing was about 9 years ago on a domestic flight in India, going from Mumbai to Delhi, and they lit them up. And I don't think I've seen it, if it's, I haven't seen it on a domestic carrier in years. Again, that's why, I said to her, I said, if need be, that will light. And she said, there's lights in the floor. I'm not, in any way throwing her under the bus. I mean, she never knew, how would she?
Any other questions for Bill?
There's other health points of concern for health is when passengers get onto the plane, the airline or the gate agents can control the social distancing to get on. But when they deplane, when they get off, there tends to be crowding. And apparently in the airport itself, the social distancing rule is the most frequently violated, that people naturally tend to congregate. If they're standing online or they're waiting for something, they bunch up. And there isn't much discussion about this, as far as I can tell.
Actually, Delta has been doing something about that. On my flight to Florida today, the gate agent made sure, hey, you guys cannot board until you guys actually separate. And they separated us by, I think, 5 rows apiece. And they made sure, they actually ensured that all of us were at least 6 feet apart. And getting off the plane, they said, everyone, please sit down until the row ahead of you has actually cleared and started walking towards the exit. So everyone actually sat down on the plane until it was their turn to get up, which I thought was phenomenal because I've never seen that even prior to the pandemic, but now post-pandemic, like Delta's actually really starting to enforce these safety protocols. And I think they're starting to realize that whether they make people mad or not, it all comes down to safety. Hey, look, you can get mad at me all you want, but we're here for safety. And, we'd much rather you get mad at us than, you get sick and then have to try to sue us because we didn't do our jobs properly. So I know I'm talking a lot, but I'm a huge fan of Delta if you guys haven't noticed already.
No, we got that. That's clear, Victor. No question.
I just flew American like 4 days ago, 5 days ago, and they did the same thing. And I flew JetBlue 4 days ago, and they did the same thing. So on deplaning,
right,
on boarding the airplane, they won't let you come down without separation. But what happens is everybody bunches up in the jetway.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
so you wait for your buddy. You pass the agent, and once you get past the agent in the jetway, you stop and wait for your buddy to come up or your girlfriend, and then you go down together. So you're defeating the whole thing.
Right. Right. And I mean, they just don't have the resources to have enough people to sort of, stagnate them and have, I mean, that's a lot of personnel that would be required to oversee something like that. I think the problem has always been on the deplaning part. I mean, we've all had that experience of, you know, that especially on a larger aircraft where there's a lot of people, you know that it's going to be a long time before you finally, if you're in the back of the plane. And yet there's people bringing over, you know, bags out of the overhead bin, and they're all over the place, right? You know, some of these things the airline industry has brought on itself, you know, when they went with the check bag fees, it obviously led to a huge influx in more carry-on bags, right? Those of us who are old enough remember when you didn't pay check bag fees, the first thing you did, you know, especially on a longer trip, you wanted to get rid of the big bag, and you just had a small bag and you went off on your way, right? And now everybody's lugging the big bags on, right? Just, you know, these are unintended consequences. And so look at emergency evacuation, you know, and the FAA emergency evacuation testing and procedures. You know, we have been very, very vocal. When I say we, consumer advocates have been very vocal with the FAA, saying the airline experience has changed so much in the last 20 years. When you look at how passenger load factors have really just exploded, you know, they're at levels they haven't, prior to COVID, of course, you know, they're at levels that we haven't seen since World War II, when there were troop carriers. And even, in fact, in many cases after COVID too, because they've shrunk demand, so there are fewer aircraft out. So you have that, you have the, you know, ubiquitous electronic gadgets that distract people. You have tighter seats, you have more carry-ons. All of that affects evacuations. So our argument to the FAA is you can't rely on computer modeling, you know, that was set up in the 1990s. You need to go out there and do real evacuation testing. Like I say, every time you see a, you know, a real life, you know, there was an event, there was a fatal accident in Russia about 2 years ago, and I keep waiting for the report, because there was evidence that one passenger might have been responsible for a few deaths because he was adamant about getting his bags out of the overhead bin, you know. There has to be more education about these things.
I worked in an accident in Los Angeles where we had two passengers had a fist fight at the overwing exit, and the forward exits were damaged, so the doors wouldn't open, and one of the rear exits couldn't be used because there was a flame and fire back there. So they only had two exits out of the airplane, and these two jerks are fist fighting over who's going to get out the overwing exit first.
Well, and you know, when like anything else, when you're dealing with big numbers, when you say, well, I'll just stop and grab my laptop because I have so many important documents on that laptop, so I'll open the overhead bin. How long is that going to take? 2 to 3 seconds? Well, now multiply 2 to 3 seconds times 300 people, right? And so that's life and death for the people that are at the back of the line, right? And it doesn't seem like a lot, but again, this is education. It's like, you know, and the FAA has a lot of work to do in this area. There's no question, but so do the airlines.
Captain Professor Emerson had a comment that I think Bill, I don't know, do you know Emerson?
I don't think we've met, no.
We met quite a while ago when you were at Vaughan giving a talk about one of your books. It's probably been 6 or 7 years ago.
Now that I hear your voice, I remember it. Yeah. Good to see you again.
I don't know if that's
Yes.
I don't know if that's good or bad.
No, that's good. Yeah, that's a voice meant for radio. You have a good voice. Yeah.
Well, thank you, and I really appreciate you.
Captain on United.
Oh, you must have given great announcements. And yeah, absolutely.
Well, I like to think so, but and thank you for being here. No, I just made the comment because I'm glad you mentioned about Delta, and you know, over the years, even I was Continental most of my career, and then United just before I retired. So I always, and Delta wouldn't even interview me back in the 80s. So I never had great feelings about Delta, but I always respected them as a business, right, and how they took care of their employees. And it's been obvious over the years how they take care of their customers. And now with COVID, I mean, I'm proud of them for doing what they're doing with that middle seat and holding to that. And like you said, a very interesting thing about, you know, anything that is good for consumers, Wall Street seems to hate. And I keep in touch with a lot of current United pilots on a pilot forum. And the animosity that, not all, but a lot of pilot employees have towards anything not United, it's disappointing. And I think that's why I made the comment that I think some airlines don't like passengers. It's just that simple. They just simply don't like passengers. And airline employees, especially in the airline industry, are very loyal to their company. So I think it translates to a lot of employees don't like passengers. When I was in college, I was a bartender, and that's the first job I had. I learned a lot about customer service. And then by the time I got to the airlines, I realized, wow, this isn't really about customer service. So, if Delta, like you said, when we're beyond the pandemic, if Delta can really cash in literally on how they're doing things, more power to them.
I agree. I mean, because like I say, it's credit where it's due. And I would love to see an airline that's doing something that's the right thing be rewarded financially, just so that you could say to the analysts that are punishing them, and they do punish them. They devalue, Southwest, their stock would be worth more if they charged baggage fees for the first 2 bags. I mean, you have to wrap your head around that. They're being customer friendly. And the thing about Southwest, they have very loyal customers, probably the highest, loyalty of any US airline, for what they do. They're for the most part, they tend to retain passengers, but when I worked in the airlines, my first airline to tell a war story was Overseas National Airways, ONA. And for the most part, we had passenger aircraft, but we had cargo aircraft. And one time I was sent up to Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts. I wound up staying there for 2 years. And we had a cargo flight. It was the first cargo flight I worked. And we had a mechanical. So the plane was stuck overnight. John wasn't there to fix it. And a DC-8 and, 18 pallets of cargo. And they said, okay, we're going to offload all this cargo and put it in the hangar. And we're all going home for the night. And the guy that was supervising it turned to me and he said, what are you doing on the passenger side? He said, this is how you have a delay. Look, they don't argue, they don't complain, they don't ask for food, they don't ask for hotels. You just take the pallets and put them in the hangar and at the time I laughed, but I look back on that and I think about that a lot. It's like, that's an attitude, it is a customer service industry, but when I worked in the airlines, I'm freely admitting this. We had a mentality. I was at some carriers until I got to Pan Am, and then I learned another way to do it. But I was at some carriers where I wouldn't say the passengers were the enemy, but they were not their best interests were not always our best interests, And then I'm very thankful the last 2 years of my airline career was at the Pan Am shuttle, right across the street from Vaughan at the Marine Air Terminal, the most beautiful building in New York City. And I worked in operations control and I was a FAA licensed dispatcher, and I learned there. It was like I made decisions where I would delay a flight or I would reschedule a flight or add a new flight based on 2 or 3 passengers, on what was best for them. Because we made a promise, we'll get you to Washington. And if the flight went over, it was my job. I would release another aircraft. We had spare aircraft and crew. Imagine that. It's a luxury now. But you're right. I think you raised a great point. That it should be a customer service industry. And if the interests of your customers are not your interests, that's a fundamental problem. That's really a fundamental problem.
Okay, so
Thank you,
we
though.
have taken an incredible amount of your time and we are incredibly appreciative. Is there time for maybe one more question?
Sure, on my end, absolutely.
While we're waiting for questions, I wanted to just make a comment that I've been looking at some of the research on masks, and there was a study where they observed people coming into a supermarket and found that 40% were wearing face masks. And then after a mask mandate went into effect, the proportion wearing a face mask went up to 75%. So it is helpful to have some clear guidance or rules.
Yeah, I noticed the other day,
Texas notwithstanding.
well, I was just going, in relation to that, I noticed the other day that the FAA announced a huge fine against not an airline, but an individual passenger who had struck a flight. I mean, absolutely indefensible, struck a flight attendant, but it was over mass. So whether or not, they're using that as sort of a test case to get the word out there that this is unacceptable, but it was a very high fine against this individual. The flight attendant told him to put on a mask. He didn't, and he punched the flight attendant. And so to me, I spoke to someone who was knowledgeable about it, and he said, well, that's just one of 10,000 cases. I said, well, maybe it's the test case then. The fact that the person got violent made it, that much more indefensible. But so maybe a new message, maybe there's a message that there's a new sheriff in town at the FAA. We'll see. I just got to say, mentioning flight attendants, I have such tremendous respect for flight attendants, not just because I worked in the airlines and I know flight attendants, but you know how as a society, people often say we shove everything off to schools. We say, well, if there's a problem in society, let the schools deal with it, right? There's hunger among children, let the schools deal with it. There's crime, well, I think in the airline industry, the response is often let the flight attendants deal with it. After 9/11, we'll let them be security agents. After this, let them be health expert. We're gonna make people bring on carry-ons because they're, the check bag fees. So we'll make flight attendants, lift up, 75-pound bags, put them in the other. Look, I'm a consumer advocate, and when flight attendants don't treat passengers well, I'll be the first one to criticize them. But I just think their job gets tougher and tougher every year. It's like they just keep getting more and more responsibilities.
Well, I think you're going to be very happy when you read the news tonight about your favorite former Secretary of Transportation.
You know what? Just as I was preparing, I saw the headline. I haven't read it yet, but I did see a very interesting headline about Secretary Chow. Yeah. Can you enlighten us?
Well, apparently there was a very strong IG report that actually had a criminal referral for ethical lapses regarding her family's company, which the Trump administration Justice Department declined to prosecute, but that doesn't mean that it can't be prosecuted. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, a lot of people thought her ethical lapses were outrageous, but then again, there were so many outrageous ethical lapses. But
I don't think she's going to be calling me as a character witness. I'm pretty sure about that.
Well, you are fantastic, and I know I appreciate you. Dr. Lubner writes beautiful, appreciative letters.
I have a very long one coming, but really fabulous. Bill, thank you so much. We really appreciate this is an enormous amount of time and preparation, commitment, support of Vaughan College. I should also mention that Bill has helped mentor one of our graduate students with her thesis. So he's been, in the time that he hasn't been actively here at Vaughan, he stays in touch with people. And I think other students have contacted him over the years. And just a tremendous contact for all of us to have. And thank you on my behalf as a passenger, because it's really frustrating sometimes to fly without those rights being pushed forward. So really appreciate the work you do in general, as well as here at Vaughan. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm a huge fan of Vaughan. I didn't mention, but I was born and raised about 5 blocks away from Vaughan in Jackson Heights, right off Northern Boulevard, 86th Street, right down the block.
Oh yeah.
So used to play baseball in what was an empty lot next to Vaughan, believe it or not. I know parking is at a premium now, but it wasn't then.
Right.
But I love coming to Vaughan, and thank you very much. I'm very honored to always come here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.